Hello and welcome to the Grandfather's Cave. In this video I'm going to talk about armor and weapons in fantasy role-playing games. The rules that I present in this video can be applied to any Dungeons & Dragons game regardless of edition, with little to no rework. If you're new to this channel or have not done so already, please subscribe and press the notification bell so that you don't miss any future videos. Now, let's roll initiative and let's get started. I have always loved the simplicity of combat in Dungeons & Dragons games, and whenever I have seen a supplement that introduces new armor and weapons, I've been very excited about that. However, there have always been some inconsistencies that I have not been able to reconcile with. And even though I couldn't put my finger on it, that sensation remained for many years. Here on YouTube, I have discovered a number of HEMA and medieval weapon and armor enthusiasts, such as Scholar Gladiatoria, Scalagrim, and Shadiversity. And watching their videos, I figure out what I think is wrong with weapons and armor in Dungeons & Dragons. And I set out to fix that. To start with, there's this whole discussion about whether armor should make it harder to get hit or if it should subtract to the damage that you're receiving when in combat. And while I really recognize the merit of armor subtracting damage, I also love the armor class system. So actually I went and did both. As you can see in the armor table that I have provided, armors have been divided into three main groups: light armor, medium armor, and heavy armor. And of course there are shields as well. What you will see when you look at this table is that the statistics of these items resemble those of the Pathfinder 1 or the Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 rules very much. There's, however, one change. I have reduced the armor value of armors by 1 point, and I have given the armors a damage absorption value, a DA value. The DA value for light armors is 1, for medium armors it's 2, and for heavy armors it's 3. And that means that when a character gets hit in combat, they can subtract that amount from the damage they receive. For medium armor, the math here is pretty solid, as it has been long established that a +1 point on attack rolls equals a +2 to damage. So this system is skewed a bit against light armor and a bit positively towards heavy armor. But I think that makes sense, because in order to use heavy armor in the Avern Fantasy RPG, you have to take a proficiency with it. Likewise, most characters are able to use light armor with little or no training. Of course, your class should have proficiency with light armor for you to be able to use it without problems. But even wearing light armor without proficiency does not apply a lot of penalties. Even a wizard untrained in armor can benefit from wearing padding or light leather armor, since it does not have any armor check penalty. Thus, they are not penalized in any way and still have the benefit of damage absorption and maybe even the benefit of an armor class bonus. Moving beyond leather armor into gambeson, chain shirts, or even medium or heavier armor, the wizard would be penalized, however, since the armor check penalty applies to the power checks that an arcane magic user needs to make in order to cast their spells. I will not get into details here, but the magic system that I use in the Avern Fantasy RPG resembles a bit that you know from Dungeon Crawl Classics. That means that a spellcaster has to make a power check against a difficulty that is determined by the rank of the spell they are attempting. And most arcane magic users would try to avoid the penalties that even a gambeson or a chain shirt apply to their power check. Unlike armors, shields do not apply damage absorption. Aside from the armor class bonus that shields apply, light and heavy shields apply a bonus equal to the armor class modifier on any attempt to make parry maneuvers with that shield. Thus, blocking attacks with shields is usually more effective than trying to block them with a weapon. And while a buckler is a small and very handy shield, it is not generally useful. In these rules, it provides a +1 armor class bonus, but only against melee attacks. And since the buckler was most commonly used with a sword according to medieval treatises, the +1 bonus to parry that shields would normally apply with a +1 armor class modifier only applies if the buckler user is fighting with a blade in their main hand. And lastly, tower shields apply a +4 bonus to armor class. However, they are extremely large and unwieldy, and the user of a tower shield takes a -2 penalty on attack rolls when they are holding a tower shield. A tower shield can also be used as a barrier. By expending a single action, you can choose a certain direction to protect yourself from, and you have the benefit of partial cover from all attacks from that direction, thus using them as mobile barriers for archers or crossbowmen to hide behind. Regardless of whether you're using 5e, 3.5 or AD&D rules, these changes to armor and shields may provide exciting variation and opportunities for your players in your Dungeons & Dragons game. The rework of weapons in the Avern Fantasy RPG has focused both on the mechanics and the conceptualization of many of the traditional role-playing game weapons. To start with the mechanics, I have introduced something called threat. This is a bit inspired by the critical rules of Dungeons & Dragons 3.5. However, there's a twist. In my version of Dungeons & Dragons, a 20 is always a critical hit. You don't have to make any confirmation rolls, and that attack automatically deals maximum damage for that weapon. However, there's also something called threat. Most weapons will have a threat of 20/2. When a character or a monster rolls a natural roll with the 20 that equals the number on the left side of the threat value, there's an opportunity there to deal extra damage. If the threat value is 20, that extra damage may apply on an unnatural roll of 20. Some weapons, however, have a value of 19 or 18, which means that there's an opportunity to deal extra damage on a roll of 19 or higher, or a natural 18 or higher on the 20 die. But before going any further, I have to make mention of the luck ability score in the Avern Fantasy RPG. While the luck ability is like any other ability in the game, and usually ranges from 3 to 18, and has a static modifier that ranges respectively from -4 to +4. A character's luck ability also determines that character's luck die. Characters with a luck score of 9 to 11 have a luck die of a d4, which is also the baseline for most monsters. However, if you have a luck score of 13 or 14, your luck die is a d6. If your luck score is 15 to 16, you have a d8. And if you have a luck score of 17 or higher, your luck die is a d10. Likewise, if your luck score is below 9, your luck die will become increasingly smaller. Back to the threat value. When an attacker rolls a natural roll equal to the threat value of their weapon, they have to make a luck roll-off against the defender. That means that the attacker and the defender each roll their luck die. And if the attacker rolls equal or higher than the defender, they are allowed to deal bonus damage equal to the multiplier on the right side of the slash times their luck die. Thus, in most occasions, when a monster or character is fighting with a weapon that has a threat of 20/2, if they roll a natural 20, they roll a d4 against their defender. And unless the defender rolls higher than the attacker on the luck die, the attacker will deal 2 times their luck die, or 2d4 for most monsters, as a bonus damage. As you can see, this means that weapons like a dagger or a crossbow have a better opportunity of dealing bonus damage, and weapons like a sickle, a spear, or even the crossbow again, deal an increased amount of damage based on the luck die. Thus, a character with a high luck and thus a high luck die will tend to score more and higher bonus damage on a threat than a character with a low luck. And correspondingly, the character with the higher luck will usually sustain this type of bonus damage more rarely than characters with a low luck ability score. Aside from the threat value, weapons in this system also have special weapon characteristics. Some of them may seem familiar to you, like Monk. That means that this is a weapon that a monk is proficient with, and with which the monk character has special advantages. Or non-lethal, which means that the weapon deals non-lethal damage. But others may be new to you, and I will quickly present them now. The first one is Armor Piercer, or AP. A weapon with AP ignores the amount of damage absorption that is given in the parentheses after the AP. Thus, a light crossbow with an AP of 2 will ignore 2 points of damage absorption from armor. Thus, the light crossbow will ignore all the damage absorption of light and medium armor, and heavy armors will only provide 1 point of damage absorption against the light crossbow. Brace is a classic. That means that if you have readied an action to attack an opponent that is charging you, you deal double damage. Disarm means that you get a +2 bonus on combat maneuvers to disarm. And duel means that this single weapon can be used to make extra attacks as if you were using 2 weapons. A hit with a weapon that has the entangle characteristic gives the target the entangle condition. And weapons with the finesse characteristic allows a character with the weapon finesse feat to use the dexterity instead of the strength modifier when making melee attacks. Firearms have the special characteristic firearm. In these rules, firearms have open-ended damage rules, which means that if you roll the maximum value on a damage die, you re-roll that die and add it to the damage result. In addition, these weapons malfunction on a natural 1, inflicting 1d6 damage on the user. Weapons with the grapple special characteristic will allow the wielder to make a free grapple maneuver against their target on a critical hit. Like Armor Piercer, load also has a number in a parentheses. The number following the load characteristic designates the number of double actions that a character needs to spend in order to load this weapon. If instead of a number there's an X in the parentheses, that means that loading this weapon requires a single action. Parry as well has a number in a parentheses, and this number can be added whenever you attempt to make a parry maneuver with this weapon. Weapons with reach can be used to attack opponents that are 5 to 10 feet away from the wielder, and weapons with the shield breaker characteristic have a +2 bonus on sunder combat maneuvers made against shields. And finally, weapons with the trip characteristic add a +2 bonus on trip combat maneuvers. So these are the basic mechanical changes that I have introduced for weapons. The other change I mentioned before was the conceptualization of the weapons. I have tried to move away from some of the very fantasy and illogical interpretations of weapons in Dungeons & Dragons and have been inspired by actual medieval weapons. This reconceptualization of weapons is most visible in the names and the damage types of these weapons. I will start with the crossbow. As you can see on the weapon table, crossbows are still simple weapons that require minimal training to use effectively. However, they have a potential to deal devastating damage, which is reflected on the threat values of the crossbows. So even while the crossbows themselves have a damage value that is similar to that of most other Dungeons & Dragons games, they can deal much more damage on account of this threat value. And while both light and heavy crossbows are slow weapons to load, I have tried to reflect their deadliness and their effectivity against armor by giving both heavy and light crossbows an armor-piercing value. Thus, while the crossbow is still a slow weapon that most seasoned adventurers will not want to use, those same seasoned adventurers will have to respect a mob aiming a dozen crossbows at them, because they are very dangerous weapons. The next point is the battle axe. As I understand it, battle axes were commonly used to dislodge or break shields, and thus they have the shield breaker characteristic. And you might be wondering what the falchion is doing here among the one-handed weapons. In earlier editions of the game, the falchion was represented as a two-handed weapon, but historic falchions normally had very short handles and were thus purely one-handed weapons that would not have been used very effectively with two hands. And in addition, while the falchion is a very good chopping weapon, many falchions also had a point that could be used to deal deadly injuries. So the falchion is now a piercing or slashing weapon. That means that it can do either of these damage types and is only a one-handed weapon. As you can see on the description of the falchion, the weapons presented here also have a replacement entry. For the falchion, the replacement entry states other weapons that would have statistics equal to or comparable with this weapon. And for the falchion, those replacement weapons could be the dao, the falcata, the koppesh, the kopis, the mesa, a saber, the scimitar, or the shamshir. By introducing this replacement entry, I seek to do away with exploding weapon lists that have 10 times as many weapon entries, while most of those entries are basically identical to other weapons. As you can see, another one-handed weapon is a sword. In many games, this is called a longsword. But historically, a longsword was an entirely different weapon, and I'll get to that in a moment. As you can see in the replacement entry for a sword can also be an arming sword, a backsword, a broadsword, even a jan, a ninjato, a spatha, or a sifas. All those I think would be acceptably represented by this sword entry. The sword is both a piercing and a slashing weapon. It can do either type of damage. While many of these swords are very well used to doing slashing attacks, they are also definitely meant to be used as thrusting weapons. And thus having them represented as solely slashing weapons, I think is absolutely ridiculous. And the next weapon I want to discuss is the warhammer. This is not the fantasy warhammer represented in most Dungeons & Dragons games. This is a historic warhammer that usually sported a very large spike on the backside of the hammerhead, and thus the warhammer does 1d6 damage and can do both piercing or bludgeoning damage. And in addition, this weapon has a very high armor-piercing value, since it was designed specifically to negate the benefits of armor. Moving on to two-handed martial weapons, we can see that just like the battle axe, the great axe also has the shield breaker characteristic. And just like there's a great axe, I have introduced a great hammer. The great hammer would be something that resembles your two-handed fantasy hammer, or maybe even a very heavy mallet. It is big, it is heavy, it can deal a lot of damage. Just like Gygax before me, I am also a bit of a polearm fan. But I decided to reduce my list of 20 plus polearms to just 8, and these also have replacement values. So if you're missing some sort of polearm on this list, odds are that it should be covered by one of the other polearms. For instance, there is no Bec de Cabrin, but I think it is fair to assume that it has functionalities that are basically identical to those of a Lothrian hammer. The other polearms are the Badish, the Bill, the Fouchard, the Glaive, the Halberd, Partisan, and the poleaxe. As you can see from their special characteristics and the damage types they provide, these are specialized weapons that serve very specific functions on a battlefield. And now we move on to the exotic weapons. Among the one-handed melee weapons, you will find the longsword. As you can see, it has statistics that are very much equivalent to those that you in other Dungeons & Dragons game would call a bastard sword. That is because the longsword is meant to be used in two hands, and a very strong or proficient user might be able to use it successfully in one hand, but it is a two-handed weapon, and like other swords, it can do both piercing and slashing damage. Likewise, the maul is an oversized hammer, and just like the longsword, you can use it in one hand if you had exotic weapon proficiency with this weapon. Otherwise, it would be a two-handed weapon. The maul also has the trip special characteristic, and that is not because you stick it between the legs of someone and they fall on the ground like you would with a whip, or because you can hook someone with it just like you would with a polearm, but it's simply a reflection of the mass of the weapon and the ability of the wielder to knock them on their ass with a heavy blow. And just like the maul would be a good representation of a fantasy warhammer, the war axe is probably a good representation of a fantasy axe as well. It is larger than the normal medieval axe, but not quite as big as the great axe or the Dane axe. But still, it has the same basic functionalities and is very good at breaking shields. You will also see among the two-handed exotic weapons that there's something called a great falchion. This represents what you probably will think of when you think of the Sultan's bodyguard, a man wielding a very large, oversized scimitar. And right under the great falchion, you have the greatsword. Unlike normal swords, the greatsword is wielded in a very specific way, and thus, to my mind, requires specialized training. It has the same basic characteristics as greatswords used to have in other Dungeons & Dragons games, but they have the added advantage of having reach of 5 to 10 feet, which means that it's most effective when used against opponents at a certain distance. Thus, against an opponent with a greatsword, a character would often try to get in very close, where they cannot wield the weapon effectively and would have to use it as an improvised weapon. In addition, this greatsword also has a parry value of 1, which means that it is well suited to block attacks. This reflects the greatsword's longer reach and its oversized crossguard. I hope you found this take on armors and weapons interesting and something that you might want to use in your own game. The tables and weapon descriptions of these items I will add a link to in the description of this video. If you enjoyed the content of this video, I suggest that you press the notification bell and subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss future videos, and that you press the like button. Until next time, keep playing.